Dr. Herbert's research interests are varied. He has examined different visual illusions, spent a lot of time trying to understand the perception of structure in the world, and is interested in the timing and locus of different perceptual and cognitive processes. I told you we were lucky to have him here today. In the past couple of years, Dr. Herbert has been doing research on the perception of faces and facial expressions, and this includes work with various students on the relative salience of different facial expressions. Dr. Herbert also works in the multidisciplinary vision research lab housed in the Carlson Center for Imaging Science at RIT. This interdisciplinary lab hosts researchers in psychology, imaging science, IT, and NTID. Currently, they are examining eye movements during change detection and responses to emotional faces, among other things. Dr. Herbert also has a long-standing interest in how we perceive color and objects and intends to pursue research in these areas in the future. Please help me welcome Dr. Andy Herbert.
But now you can really hear me. Hi, everyone. So what I'm going to do, I was told not everyone would have done their homework. So you're assuming that I can prevent you from having to do this to the book. I did my homework. So I'm grateful for the chance to come and talk to you today, and also for the free book that I was interested in reading already. So that was good. My plan is to run through give you a quick overview, show you a couple of demos, hopefully so that you'll ooh and ah and be convinced by Kahneman's wisdom. And then I'll point out a couple of errors as I see them in his interpretation. And of course, I'll focus on visual perception, not the economics. I actually sat in on someone's economics class evaluating his teaching recently, and if it was in French, I would have understood more because I speak French. So with that, I'll get started. If I'm going through and I go too fast or you have a question, feel free to stop me, and then I have lots of time for questions afterwards. So let's see if technology will conspire. Okay, so it's a relatively long book. So this is my review. You can leave now. It's about 420 pages. Probably the best part of the book, from my perspective, is that he includes a couple of his most important articles at the back that one can read at one's leisure to read the primary science. There are 5 sections where he introduces this idea of 2 systems, System 1 and System 2. He gives them people's names at first and then never uses those names again. Then he talks about the fact that he does a section that when I teach cognitive psychology, come on. So I'm not going to be free to wander at this rate. When I teach cognitive psychology, I give a couple of lectures on judgment. I call them the people are stupid lectures. It's actually people are lazy. So talking about heuristics and biases, stereotyping, all those things that we can criticize one another for when we make mistakes, but really we take shortcuts all the time. And biases, heuristics, rules of thumb that we apply are actually features, they're cognitive economy. Then I'll talk about overconfidence, as he calls it. That's really the fact that most of us are terrible at statistics, and we demonstrate that whenever we buy a lottery ticket. And then there's the section on economics, which he calls choices, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally come to the 2 selves section, where he really presents some bigger issues, so that's why I said that refers to life. So my general observations are, and I think the first one is true for virtually any nonfiction book I read. I read Blink. I didn't really. I read the first 2 chapters and went, okay, the chapter 2 is exactly the same as chapter 1. I have other stuff to read, like student papers. So the stuff I already knew, which is the first third of the book, I suppose, I felt like was getting too much of the same thing over and over again. I'm familiar with these heuristics. I'm familiar with these demonstrations. So that was the jaded me. And then it was repetitive when it got to choices, because that was all economics. And he'd made his point that economists have been wrong and will continue to be wrong. Oh, sorry, are there any economists here? So being able to predict the activity of large groups is difficult, and economists face a very difficult task, especially as policy changes what they have to do. And I thought he made his point. It was a little long. So it's long, but I guess to justify the cover price, you have to have a lot of pages. It's very well written, except when it comes to these little exercises. And if you are planning to read the book, or if you have read the book, he has lots of demos in there, and you have to do them. There's no point at all in not, and most of them take 10 seconds, except for multiplying 24 by 17 in your head. If you have to skip that, that's fine. If you come up with the wrong answer, that's fine. But sometimes his instructions are a little lacking. He's being very careful with the words he uses, so I'll make an excuse for him. But he's won the Nobel Prize, so he doesn't need any excuses from me. The other thing is, you don't have to read the whole book. If you, at the end of each chapter, there are anywhere from 2 to 4 or 5 statements, and they're written as little quotes almost, and rather than ending each chapter with a chapter summary, he ends with these little statements, and they're almost perfectly capturing the sense of each chapter. So I think there's 39 or 40 chapters. Really, you only have 39 pages to read, and then you can converse with people about the book. I didn't figure that out till halfway through, so I had to finish reading it. And this book is really about people and the mistakes we make and the reasons we make those mistakes and those decisions. And given elections, discussions about healthcare, public policy, et cetera, it's a very relevant book. So now I'm going to get to talking about some of the specifics. So this idea of 2 systems, System 1 and System 2. From 10 to noon, I'm teaching a class called Attention and Spatial Vision. I could have just given most of this at 10 o'clock, but I didn't. I'll save it for later for them. And I notice, just like when I was teaching, there's one right in the front row. And these guys are hoping I don't come over here. So I just taught, teaching a class, the idea of 2 systems, we were talking about the nature of pre-attentive processing versus attentive processing. And this kind of 2 systems hierarchy or 2 system structure is common to many models of the brain, the mind, the eye, the duplex nature of the retina. And I think it's a pretty good way of capturing it. You have System 1 that works very quickly, doesn't take into account all the facts, jumps to conclusions, and works perfectly most of the time. And then you have System 2 that's thoughtful, slow, and lazy. It's funny how he describes it that way, but it's probably, people are fundamentally mentally lazy when it comes to things that don't really grab them. So that thing you really like, you can talk about, you can study for hours and hours and hours, you can read books on the topic of interest, and then someone starts talking about economics and right? System 2 doesn't want to have to do anything. And I see many of you probably have children or grandchildren, so we can complain about video games and people's attention span, et cetera, et cetera. I believe people have always been lazy, according to Kahneman's model. So the System 1 does just perfectly most of the time, and Kahneman spends a lot of time with these failures because they're interesting. And the failures are because if you apply a rule of thumb to all situations, sometimes your thumb isn't the right size. And so that's part of what goes on. So I'm going to focus on a couple of examples. I'm going to show you some figures, and sorry, I'm Canadian, well, it's probably just a personal, I say figure, I mean figure. I'll blame it on my Canadianness. So what I'm going to show you is a picture. It's going to flash up quite briefly, and I just want you to tell me what you see. So what did you see? Angry woman. So this is one of, the first figure in the book. It's actually a picture from Ekman's set of faces. So that show, Lie to Me, is based on the ideas of Paul Ekman. We've used that set of stimuli to test face processing in people. And what you saw was an angry face. Now I presented that as short as I can present it here, roughly 100 milliseconds if everything worked correctly, and people were pretty unanimous in saying angry, and male or female? Not so certain there, but sounds like the majority say female. And so now let's see it again. Anyone still say male? Right, it doesn't take long. Now here's another example he gives. How does this picture make you feel? What emotional expressions are being shown here? I assume this is for me. What's on the right? So this is one of those times where Kahneman, so this is supposed to be fear, surprise, and this is supposed to be a smiling face. And actually, if I'd attached electrodes to you, he goes through this, attach electrodes to someone, your heart rate would have gone up slightly upon looking at the left-hand picture. So all the signs of physiological arousal, your fight or flight response would have been slightly activated seeing the left-hand picture. Same thing goes for the picture of the woman beforehand, the woman with the very angry face. We pick that up really fast. Does the sex of the face matter? Not as much as the emotional expression. Happy, you'd have a different response to angry, regardless of whether it's a male or female. And what Kahneman describes is work by others showing just how powerful these system 1 kind of stimuli are. I think this is figure 4 from the book. What it is the x-axis is pounds paid. The scenario is there's a voluntary pay milk and coffee system at a British school. And what they did is each week they put up pictures. So they either put up flowers or eyes. And the emotional expression, if you look at these, you can see these are clearly different expressions, probably not really a person. I'm not sure I want him looking at me for too long. Right? Different emotional expressions, but the key being that with eyes, people paid more into the kitty than when there were flowers. So if you think someone is watching you, you behave differently. I can't speak for women. In the men's room, people are far more likely to wash their hands if someone else is there. And then you can all go like this. And note, there's no test of statistical significance here, but scary eyes gets you the most milk money. So system 1 works very quickly, takes in a lot of information. People have been working for years to develop computer systems that could recognize facial expression, be able to quickly determine facial expression, get the responses. This is something you can do pre-consciously, pre-attentively, automatically. Now I'm going to show you another picture. And this is another example of system 1 working well. This will flash up, but for a lot longer. So just what can you tell me about this picture? Did it show? Okay. Three stacks? So if you had to describe the picture to someone who's not in the room, it's 3 stacks, all the same height? What was it? So 2 the same, and does everyone agree the left and right ones were identical in height? Identical in height, different in composition? Were there the same number, they're made of little blocks, were there the same number of blocks in the middle as in either of the stacks? And whatever answer you give, I know you don't know, right? You're probably guessing. You're like, well, it's a trick, so probably yes, but I didn't. So this is an example of system 1 versus system 2 working. So you can check, if you count the little blocks, they're the same number of blocks here as here. And on the right hand side, clearly these are the same height. So you can make a quick judgment of the overall very well, very accurately, but the details you can require verification or you won't quite get right. And that's another example of system 1 versus system 2 type processes. What Kahneman's doing is he's taking 100 years, let's say, of psychological research and really trying to get it down to this 2-system idea. And he does so pretty persuasively. And just to show you that it's not just words, and this leads us to the next part of the book, if you read this about Linda, a 31-year-old, she's single, outspoken, very bright, majored in philosophy, and as a student she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and she also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Right, so you have your mental picture of Linda. Which is more probable? Is she a bank teller, or a bank teller, an activist, and a feminist? So the system 2 knows that number 1 is correct. System 1 keeps saying she's also, there are more bank tellers. Think of everyone familiar with Venn diagrams? So the idea is that you have a set, bank tellers who are also feminists. Every one of them is also a bank teller. But there's probably lots of misogynist bank tellers. There's lots of different kinds of bank tellers out there. Statistically, this is a case of we're terrible with large numbers and we're great with examples. The mental picture for Linda that was created was someone who is socially active, interested in issues that make you think she's a feminist, and that identification as a feminist is strong, overcomes the mathematics. And there were a couple of people who said 1, and most people were saying 2, those of you who spoke out. That's what you find. When lots of people make these kinds of judgments, there are a few who overcome the availability of feminist to see the number picture. And perhaps there are more economists in that group. So even though there must be more, the question didn't ask, the question is, which is more probable? It's a math question, and what you answered with was what was more likely given the description. And one of the characteristics of the laziness of system 2, and this leads to 100 pages of examples, this is it's a good book. I like the book. And I felt free to skip. Pages. Then I felt guilt because I was presenting, so I had to go back and read them. Feel free to skip pages. Once he makes the point, sometimes like yeah. Where's the next thing? And that's where those end of chapter statements are great, because you can check whether you should skip or read. Of course, if you're really suffering from insomnia, read choices. So system 2 doesn't want to do more than it has to do. So you have to engage system 2 to fully process the problem. And what we do is something that he demonstrates and talks about it quite frequently. We substitute. You take the what is probable and you say probability, blech, unless you're a stats professor. I teach statistics too, so I can't respond that way when I'm teaching that class. You take what is probable and you substitute with what is Linda like, or some simpler question. Anyone? It takes some time. Maybe it's even mulling over. I think it's 408, isn't it? He gives the answer in the book. Is it 378? Oh, there you go. I was too lazy to do the math.
But before you said 24 by 17, and this was.
Oh, is it 17? Yeah, 17 by 24. I entered 2 numbers that you couldn't multiply in your head quickly unless you really wanted to, or if you're a polymath. So when you're making judgments, there's a long list of these heuristics. I just want to talk about a couple of them. One of them is availability, and that's the Linda example. What's available, the most recent information, is what you use in making the decision. And nowhere did we learn that Linda was really interested in counting money, or that Linda was interested in... What we learned about in that description were Linda's politics, Linda's attitudes, and so on. So it's those attitudes that resonate with people on average. So availability is what you use. And then the other thing that happens is substitution, as already described. You take a difficult question and you answer a simpler question. We don't all do this for every we all do this sometimes. For any one question, there will always be people who crack the code. Heuristic rule of thumb. It's a fancy psychological name for a rule of thumb. Slightly better than rule of thumb, as opposed to counting in hands, and so on. But that's all it is. Heuristics, the application of a rule of thumb leads to biases. The fact that we tend to pigeonhole each other, that most of the time stereotyping works. and I'm talking in the term of, if you see someone and the person looks like a male to you, there's a set of common responses in our society that you would give, and males and females are separated from each other. And there's a long series of skits from Saturday Night Live about someone named Pat. The whole game was you can't tell whether Pat is male or female, and no one knows how to behave around that person because they can't activate. They have to use System 2, not System 1. Probably the most powerful and the most repeated heuristic is this whizzy-addy thing, which he repeats often: what you see is all there is. So WYSIWYG is what you see is, so what you type, that's, now computers are all WYSIWYG. I guess that's what he's going on. What you see is what you get. I forget what. This whizzy-addy is, what you see is all there is. System 2, fundamentally lazy. If System 1 tells System 2, there's enough information here for me to answer the question, System 2 can continue to think about that recipe for cookies or doing whatever System 2 wants to do. So the overconfidence section is all about how we're bad at probability, and both Section 2 and Section 3 of the book are really about this whizzy-addy idea. Many of the demonstrations I find compelling. It's annoying to read this book and do the demonstrations and time after time get it wrong. And time after time knowing that, and every once in a while I could tell I'd get it right, and I'd be like, yeah, and I know that's not my first instinct. Whatever your first instinct is to an answer is probably wrong. And he spent some time talking about intuition and when intuition should be trusted and when it shouldn't be trusted. If you're an expert, your intuitions, he spent some time talking about research on firefighters who, for reasons they can't articulate, leave the building before it collapses, versus clinicians who make terrible diagnoses. You can take what you want from that. Then we get to choices. And that is where he basically shows why he got the Nobel Prize. So prospect theory is what Kahneman and Tversky describe, and that is compared to expected utility theory or various versions of utility theory, which date from Bernoulli's time and more recently. There's plots like this. A quick search of prospect theory online and looking for images will show lots of these different plots. What I drew in here in green is what we expect according to traditional economic theories is that the value attached to a gain and the value attached to a loss will be equal. So that at any one time, if $1,000 means a different thing to each person in this room, and part of what it has to, whether it's plus or 1,000 or minus 1,000, shouldn't matter. But what we find in the way people respond is that losses are worth a lot more than gains. And that many of the little exercises that he has us do reading the book in Section 4 are about seeing how you respond to choices, and that when it comes to losses, we're all willing to gamble. When it comes to gains, we like the sure thing, on average. But if you don't buy a ticket, you can't win. He talks about that too. So now I have a very dense, a bunch of words. What this relates to is a thing called the framing effect. And advertisers, politicians, and other people who want you to think certain ways are very familiar with this. So the scenario is that you have a treatment that you could give people. And the example at the top is the positive frame. In program A, 200 people will be saved if they have this treatment. Or you could save 2/3 of the people. Sorry, you have a 1/3 probability of saving everyone and a 2/3 probability that everyone dies. So this is all set up to look at the gain side of the curve. Whereas in group 2, your option is 400 people will die, or you have a 1/3 probability of saving that nobody will die, and a 2/3 probability that 600 will die. And if you do the math, each of these is an identical statement. They're all different versions of the same thing. There's a positive frame focusing on who you save, and a negative frame focusing on who dies. And what you get from people are very different responses. So these are data from one particular study, not Kahneman's study, but a replication. 72% of participants pick program A. They pick the sure thing. No, they don't want to go for there's a 1/3 chance I could save everybody, but I don't want that 2/3 where everybody dies. I'll just save 200 people because I'm going to get a sure thing. Whereas if the chance is that 400 people could die, same thing, then people will gamble. Then they'll roll the dice to see what the outcome will be. And that's why the graph has this shape. For gains, you have, and it asymptotes. If the numbers get big, people have trouble. A heuristic is we have problems with large numbers. So a 1 in a million chance versus a 1 in a billion chance. We all understand what that means, but most of us haven't really seen a million anythings all at once. So a million anythings and a billion anythings, they both fall under, ooh, that's a lot. Versus 100 compared to 50 or 10. Those are differences we can grasp. Whereas for losses, they have a much bigger effect. And that's prospect theory. The prospect of a gain changes the way you behave compared to when there's the prospect of a loss. And the subjectivity of the situation matters. People don't make decisions purely rationally, which most of us know very well, except if you're an economist. People aren't always rational, and in this case, what rational means is that you're internally consistent. Given a situation where you can look at it and see that these are exactly the same situation, you expect people to respond the same way, and people don't do that. Emotion matters. He spends a lot of time talking about cases where you talk about trying to get money from people to save dolphins versus providing money for healthcare plans for human beings. And the marketing of the marketing of saving the dolphins results in more money per dolphin than people will put in for saving people. And it's all in how it's presented. And it's so relevant right now as we have the primary going on, and everyone amassing their huge treasure chests to spend like crazy. If only it was like the old days where they just bought votes directly. Just give me the money. Oh wait, I can't vote. I'm not a citizen yet. I have my green card, in case you're wondering. So I can just complain as opposed to voting. The good thing about this is, if you give people the options, and he has a few examples of this, if people are presented with both options, you don't have to spell it out. People are very good at seeing that, ooh, I was going to give more money for dolphins than for this public health issue that will affect me directly sooner. People are really logical and rational when they have all the options presented to them. And when do advertisers ever give you all the options? Right? So that's the choices section. An interesting way of depicting this also is, so here's one version of the utility theory. Prospect theory is that losses for others don't affect me as much as losses to me. So the graph scales, the effect of losses scales with personal relevance. And really, my interpretation, that's what section 4 of the book is all about. Prospect theory. The last section of the book is really about how these heuristics are how this generalizes not just to decisions that have to do with will I buy car A or car B, will I do this or that, but also how we judge our quality of life and how we judge other people's lives. And he talks then about a mood heuristic and how we substitute when asked certain questions. And I think the best way to talk about this is with one example. So if I was to ask you, how happy are you with your life these days? One way to do this we would just say, okay, what does he mean by these days? Okay, I'm going to say the last 30 days. And then you would think about each of the last 30 days and how you felt. And system 2 is going, no, I am not doing that. Did I have a good weekend? And if you had a good weekend, you'd say, yeah, life these days is pretty good. And if you had a bad weekend, if the gutters fell, the wind we had caused damage to your house or car, then life is bad. Or you could substitute with, how do I feel right now? I had a nice coffee, a cookie, the talk's almost over, right? So you get that could be, that's what you do. So you substitute for those things. And this is a huge problem for people doing polls. This is a huge problem for policy. When you ask people how they think about, how they feel, what their attitude is about a complex question, they tend to do things like think about what they just had for lunch. And they answer that way. He gives the example of when you go, who has a favorite restaurant? Does anyone have a restaurant where, and when you go, put up your hand if you have a favorite restaurant. Not just one. Okay, do you have a regular? Do you go somewhere regularly? Do you order the same thing when you go there every time? So some people are nodding, and some of you are risk takers and some of you aren't. And that relates to this idea of two selves. There's the remembered self and the experiencing self. And the remembered self, if that's overemphasized, if you emphasize the remembered self more than the experiencing self, you order the same thing. You find that dish, they make a good General Tso's chicken around the corner from my house. That's what I order. And I order that. Every once in a while I order something else, but I go back to the General because I know what I'm getting. I'm paying my $10. I want that reliable after work, I'm too lazy to cook experience. Right? So we tend to order the same thing because you won't be disappointed. Every once in a while, they might screw up on your favorite dish. But you have enough examples, you engage to say, oh, that's just, they must have hired a new cook, or someone dropped a rat in there this time. So, I've already started talking about the next slide. That is, or have I? Yeah, the experiencing self and the remembering self. That when you look at your well-being, there's what's happening now for the experiencing self, and then there's what's happening in the past, the remembering self. And he talks about how people experience colonoscopies. Is it better to have a short, painful colonoscopy or a long, not quite so painful colonoscopy? And that all depends if you're asking the experiencing self or the remembering self. And so it depends. Do I ask you during the colonoscopy or after? And if I ask you questions about the colonoscopy afterwards, short and painful is worse than long and not quite so painful. We're terrible at judging the duration of pain, for instance. Thus, well, there's all kinds of childbirth-related statements that could be made there. I'm going to skip that. So I want to talk about one area, and of course it's going to relate to a visual illusion. One error that I think he makes, although maybe I should just skip that because I'm looking at the clock. Are there any questions to this point? Well, that was a question. Someone had a question. Okay. What do you see here? Exactly. So that's right. So you know that, but what do you see? What do you perceive? Is the guy on the right taller than the guy on the left? Yeah, so everyone's you're all system 2's fully pumped up and ready to go. But what do you actually see? The guy on the right looks bigger. And as much as you know it's not true, your visual system is pumping away at you. And Kahneman makes the point that this shows that illusions are very powerful, and he argues this is a case of an error, and that he calls this a system 1 error. And I say he's a cognitive psychologist, and his wife should have talked to him about it. His wife, Anne Treisman, is a famous perceptual and cognitive psychologist. The question he asks in the book is, what do you see on the page? And he makes the point of saying on the page. My point would be that the page is not the natural world, right? If I say what's on the screen, your visual system adapted, your visual system evolved to deal with the three-dimensional world. So these cues of linear perspective that many of you noted, the fact that he's going to be run over by the subway any second, all three of them, that those cues to depth in the real world are so powerful you can't override them. I wouldn't call that a system 1 error. I'd call that the real world and the pictorial world don't match up all the time. And that this picture is a trick and it works. And in fact, what's interesting about this, he doesn't even apply his own rule. What you see is all there is. So in fact, where he says it's a system 1 error, it's a feature. If you didn't see this, it would suggest you had some kind of brain damage, or you had some kind of, it turns out people who work in the arts a lot and work in pictures, they can overcome the illusions better. The key being that the 3D world is what's natural and the 2D world is fabricated. We learn to see pictures and how to process them. He does make a convincing case that perceptual illusions are like weakened versions of cognitive illusions. So cognitive illusions are what these heuristics lead to, and they're somewhat compelling. And you could say, that's not, I suppose, it isn't the biggest error in the world, and it's a different interpretation, and I'd have to agree with you on that. I thought it was a pretty compelling book, interesting for the most part. It's well worth reading, and I gather there's a free copy up for grabs, so I hope you put your name in the box.